Okay, welcome everyone to today's speaker, Dean Takahashi. So he's a tech journalist for more than 25 years and he's covered games for 18 years. Since 2008, he's a lead writer at GamesBeat, at VentureBeat, which is an American technology website. And before that, he has covered games in a number of other outlets, including Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, and more. He also authored two books called Opening the Xbox and the Xbox 360 Unclogged. And he also organizes the annual GamesBeat and GamesBeat Summit conference. And today he will talk to us about games journalism. So welcome, Dean.
Okay, thank you. My propaganda for today is that the GamesBeat Summit is going to be happening April 9th and 10th in Berkeley at the Claremont Hotel. And yes, sadly, it is close to my alma mater, UC Berkeley. So it's a funny place to be for me right now. So I am a quiet person in general. You know, it takes me a little while to find my voice when I'm talking, so you know, I ask you to be a little bit understanding on that. You know, what I like to do is I write at night when I have more time to think about things. I really like this book by Susan Cain called Quiet, and it sort of helped me understand and come to terms with being a quiet person in a very noisy environment like game journalism. As I say, I'm happy to answer your questions. So you can judge how old I am because I was around as a kid when the original Pong came out in 1971, right? And so I played it for the first time in sort of this luxury setting at the tennis courts in the Tropicana Hotel when my family was on vacation there. And we went into the lounge, and it was very fancy. And they had these tables, and the tabletops were machines that had Pong on them. So we played them, and we put a lot of quarters into that. I grew up in Sacramento. We played this game Gunfight at one of the local sandwich shops. You know, it was a one-on-one gunfight, and you can tell by the quality of the graphics how old that is. We had an Intellivision at home. I didn't have a lot of other consoles at home, but I was definitely always in the arcades. I read Strategy and Tactics magazine, played war games on paper, immersed myself in the artificial worlds of books, you know, like Tolkien's universe and Dune. But games were something different for me. You know, they let me use my imagination more, I thought. Telling my own stories each time I played a game, I'd play it over again, it'd be a different story, right? So, like an interactive novel. So, in college at Berkeley, I became an English major. I got a job as a copy aide at the Institute for Journalism Education. They had this summer program for minority journalists there, and they took people who had no experience in journalism, minorities, and they trained them for 10 weeks over the summer and then put them into jobs at newspapers. And they did this because they felt like it was, you know, it was a mission for diversity. And that at the time, about 94% of the journalists in the US were Caucasian, right? 6% were minorities. At the time, I think about 20% of the country was minorities. And so they felt like to better reflect what's happening in minority communities and the nation as a whole, you needed a more diverse journalistic workforce. So this was affirmative action for journalists. And I would, you know, I would be the copy aide, just sort of, you know, proofreading copy, delivering the newspapers, developing film, and hanging out at Northgate Hall in Berkeley, right? So. And you know, I mentioned being quiet. Sometimes people can be too quiet to their own detriment. Japanese-American internment shaped my identity, and it led me to journalism. And you could say, you know, this modern phrase that I was a social justice warrior as far as the reason why I got into journalism, right? Let's see, I guess 1991, I was at the LA Times, and I wrote, the newspaper sort of dismissed my initial pitch, right? And then they wrote a series of stories about the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, you know, it was what you would expect, I guess, for a newspaper to do. So I pitched the stories again in February of 1992, when another anniversary of the executive order came around. And that order, of course, put Japanese Americans and my family into internment camps. I visited one of those internment camps for this story, and I you know, sort of reimagined what it was like to have been in those camps back in the 1940s, when, you know, there was nothing but wind and dust blowing everything around. And one of the internees that I interviewed later, he said that, you know, being in these barracks was like, you know, with sort of like 1-inch openings in between the pieces of wood, was sort of like having sand blown at you with a fire hose, right? So in the middle of the night, one night, that sentence that kicked off that series came to me, and it, you know, was 50 years ago here. The only thing free to come and go as it pleased was the wind, right? So my 17-year-old daughter has sort of picked up on some of these things over time. She created this image. If you notice, the Department of Justice, the lettering there says basically no justice, right? And on one of the pillars, it says, "I became a journalist because of internment." And she did this because she found an old speech I gave way back in the 1990s, and she put the lettering of the speech all over the stone there. So, you know, I thought it was a cool piece of art by my kid. So I got a master's in journalism at Northwestern. I got my first job at the Dallas Times-Herald, a newspaper that no longer exists. I started covering tech companies in Dallas. I moved to Los Angeles. My brother lived in that city. I covered tech at the LA Times in Orange County. I bought a 486 PC to play PC games, and I sort of only learned enough about technology at the time in order to play games, right? So, you know, if you had to create a boot disk to play something like A10 Tank Killer, then I would do everything I could to do that. And then once I was able to do that, I stopped learning about it. So, wrote one of the very first story on Blizzard Entertainment when they were known as Chaos Studios. You know, they sold their company for a very small amount of money these days, like $7 million or something, to Davidson and Associates. But they went on to be very successful, right? And the president of Blizzard recently said to me, you know, "Thank you for 25 years of good coverage." And it's this guy, Mike Morhaime. I covered Brian Fargo of Interplay, and I still cover him today, and he's actually about to retire. I'm not quite ready to do that. Most of my job has been covering tech companies in all of these previous jobs here, though. Games was not enough of an industry to be a real beat at a mainstream newspaper, and that was just sort of the reality of things. I would play Dr. Mario at parties at my brother's house. He would have friends come over, and we'd have like 4 TVs going at once with 4 consoles, and you know, a total of like 8 people playing at a time, and everybody sort of yelling at each other to win. The LA riots happened while I was at the Los Angeles Times. That's 1992, and you know, having come from Berkeley in the summer program for minority journalists, I was fairly conscious about diversity. I was president of the local chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association at the time. And it sort of fell on me to speak up about it and to say, hey, you know, the LA Times has done some outstanding work here, and you know, they actually won a Pulitzer Prize for the coverage of the riots. But inside the newspaper, there were a lot of people who were unhappy because it came as such a sort of blindsided surprise to everybody. And you know, the percentage of minorities in the LA Times covering the communities of color in Los Angeles was not so good. So we spoke up about it. A lot of people at the time said that my career in journalism was over because I criticized my bosses. But it's a democracy, right? And we have freedom of speech, freedom of the press. For a newspaper to crack down on someone like me because I spoke up and criticized it, would have been the ultimate hypocrisy. And so at the time, the editor at the time, Shelby Coffey, he actually agreed with that, and so he didn't actually fire me. So I thought that was great. Now, this was not such a happy time, right, in my life. 1993, my brother was murdered. It happened because there was a rivalry between two gangs where he lived in Los Angeles. And one of the gangs was going after another gang member. And they went in the middle of the night, knocked on the door of a house, and shot the guy who opened it, right? So they went to the wrong house. It was my brother's house. And so he was gone, right? So this actually had an effect on me. I couldn't play violent video games anymore for a while. They were like too close to reality. I couldn't stand the sound of gunfire. Now they caught these guys. They were one guy was 17, two of them were 18 at the time. They convicted the two older ones for sure, I know of, and put them away for life in prison. I wrote a letter to the judge when they were sentenced, and I said, life is not like a video game. You don't get a second chance when you get shot, right? And so the choices that you make are very important. So I like this quote from Kurt Vonnegut Jr., the author of Mother Night. Mother Night is a book about an American spy who poses as a Nazi propagandist. And he's a lousy spy, and he is too good at his job as a propagandist, right? And so you have to wonder, like, what was your purpose in life? Like, what did you do? And I like to think about this when you apply it to games as well. I don't want to put too heavy a sort of burden on game developers, but I think it's good to think about the interplay between fantasy and reality in your games. And there was an executive at Electronic Arts that I once interviewed, and he said that you may only get 10 games to work on in your life. If each one takes 3 years to make, 30 years, 10 games, that's all you get. So each one of the ones that you work on should be special in some way. So time went on, I got married, I had my first child. I'd play games like this, which were reasonably nonviolent, considering the subject matter, I guess. But my kid would be on my lap, and I'd play these games. I moved to this region in 1994. That was the year that Netscape went public. I started covering chips for the San Jose Mercury News. That started me on this path to be immersed in Silicon Valley and tech for the last 25 years or so. I switched to the Wall Street Journal in 1996. At that time, I was in the San Francisco bureau. I would sub for Walt Mossberg. He never played any computer games, so I would do the occasional review on games like Warbirds when he went on vacation. And so since I was the youngest guy in the office and the only guy who played games, they said, do you want to cover companies like Nintendo and Sega and EA? And I said, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And it was an interesting way to start looking at the industry in a sort of a day-to-day basis because I was a business journalist at the Wall Street Journal, trying to find ways to convey what this industry was like to people who mostly did not play games, right? I eventually moved to the Red Herring magazine, wrote this book on the making of Microsoft's first game console. And this was inspired by Tracy Kidder's Soul of a New Machine, which is a book about Data General and a couple of teams that were competing with each other to sort of create the next great computer. And it really made you feel like a fly on the wall. And so I tried to interview as many people as I could, sort of officially and unofficially, for this book to really give people a flavor of what it was like to work on a game console. I got laid off from the Red Herring. I returned to the San Jose Mercury News. The tech bubble burst there. I wrote a book on the Xbox 360 and started, writing a lot more about games. Mike Antonucci was my colleague that I would do podcasts with at the Mercury News. Nucci now, I think, works here at Stanford still. These are some things that come to mind in game journalism. You don't want to entirely rely on, the public relations people and what they tell you about, what a company is doing. You have to have a wide variety of sources. And you'll see more about this. I'll talk more about this whole subject later. When I was writing the book, I had this chance to ask, a lot of people, 100 people, about the same events that happened. And, sometimes where these stories intersect, you get a pretty good idea that what you've got is the truth, right? But sometimes you get this, right, on disputes between people about, what happened and, flawed memories and things like that. So, journalism is a muddy thing. It's not always a science. Now, sort of the interesting thing about covering games and playing games. For a while, I would only play games. I returned to playing violent games again, but I always wanted to be the good guy, right? The person who is doing good in the world of the game. And so I had a real problem with Rockstar's, Grand Theft Auto series, where, all you want to do is mayhem, right? But at some point, by the fourth installment, I could sort of appreciate how cinematic these games were getting, very, very movie-like. They're telling stories about what it's like to be people that, are not like you, and you can walk in their shoes. And as long as you have this ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, and you're responsible enough to do that, then why not go ahead and play these games, right? I moved to VentureBeat in 2008. I thought, okay, I guess, we're covering startups, we're covering the venture capital community. I'm probably not going to write any more game stories, but, that turned out to be quite wrong. I started all these things. The game startups, they proliferated with Facebook and apps in 2008. We threw our game conference during the GDC that year, and like 600 people showed up. And so VentureBeat was kind of in business covering games. So then, because of that, I got to spend 80% of my time covering games. 20% is sort of everything else in Silicon Valley now, right? In 2009, I wrote this story about the Red Rings of Death. Sometimes you would like to be able to do nothing but this kind of work, where you're unearthing things, about things like how much warning they had that this was coming, and how they decided to ship the console anyway, because they had to beat Sony out the door this time. Because the last time around, in the previous launch of the Xbox, Sony had sold 25 million units of the PlayStation 2 before they sold a single Xbox. So Microsoft was in a rush the second time around, and this is kind of what happened. So games are actually, according to Newzoo as of this morning, a $116 billion business in 2017. And 50 billion of that is mobile games. In 2011, I got my kid a flu shot, and my kid got the flu, and then I caught the flu from her, and I got pneumonia instead. And so I had nothing to do for a while, and I couldn't talk to people, so I just wrote. And I wrote these 2 ebooks. That's, a high point was writing about Blizzard's cancellation of Titan before anybody else did. But I've also made some gigantic mistakes in my career, like erroneously reporting that Google acquired Twitch, when in fact it was Amazon that did that. Google was talking to them, but turned off the talks at some point. So GamesBeat now has a staff of 7 game-related writers and editors. That's not including the tech writers that cover tech for the rest of VentureBeat. This is kind of where I am on social media. I think it's interesting that 25% of my Twitter followers are fake, and I'm not sure how to get rid of them or how that happened. I didn't actually buy those followers, so who knows how that happened. But social media is far more a part of my daily job than it ever was before. Like, we write a story. Sometimes it's like a tree falling in the forest and nobody reads it. So you actually have to share your story and figure out ways to get it in front of people. So we're kind of part of this whole attention economy, our journalists, right? But before I get a big head, the people who create games are probably more like the real celebrities of our industry here, right? And this is my tally. My analytics tells me that I've done 15,000 stories in almost 10 years at VentureBeat, 29 stories a week. That's pretty tiring. But yeah, I only do maybe a dozen game reviews a year. A lot of that is writing sort of the day-to-day business of games and technology companies. That's my favorite game. These are more of my favorite games. There aren't too many platformers on there, are there? Right. So, I read Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, and yeah, I've put my 10,000 hours into games, and many more times than that. And it raises the question: am I a gamer? Right? And then, so Gamergate came along in 2014, and in 2014, it seemed like the real theme of Gamergate was let's go harass the women in the industry, right? It was purely sexual harassment. I came out again. We actually had a blind spot here because we got into trouble before criticizing TechCrunch in a story. And it just made us really look bad because the information we had was wrong, right? An editor of ours thought he had evidence against TechCrunch doing something bad, and it turned out not to be true. We published a story, and it was just embarrassing. So we said, okay, our rule now is let's not write about the media. Let's not write about ourselves. We're not that interesting, right? Let's write about the tech companies. So this big story that affects the media comes along, and so we kind of stayed silent on this for weeks. Right, and we didn't really weigh into it, until Intel stepped in a big pile of crap and basically caved into Gamergate critics and decided to pull advertising out of Gama Sutra because their critics were complaining about Lee Alexander, a female columnist who was too strident as a feminist, right? And so Intel caved. They realized they made a mistake. And when it started spreading like this industry, then we started writing about it a lot more. I wrote a column saying how stupid this is, and how it's bad to harass the women in the industry. And even though I took a stand like that, the Gamergaters never came after me, right? And they didn't go after male journalists. Or male game developers. They went after female game developers who were outspoken, right? So I'll talk about something else that happened this year in a bit, but I interviewed Zoe Quinn about her Gamergate experience and her book that came out this year. I also talked to critics of my own in the Kotaku and Action subreddit, which you would define as pro-gamergaters. And so I got a dose of their attention this year, all because of game journalism ethics issues, which they had claimed that was what this was all about back in 2014, right? And it does make you think about like how do you cover things as someone focused on the industry here. You can be an outsider as a journalist, being objective and looking at an industry and trying to cover it as best you can. But you can also be an insider getting scoops on the industry from people you know really well, some people you trust, your friends, and that makes you a good journalist as well. But you do have to sort of go between being an outsider and an insider as a journalist. That's one of the best things about the job, and if you don't take advantage of that, then you're not doing your job right. And so I think it's a great way to see things from a different perspective that nobody else sees, right? And so I think it's good for everybody to ask, what's your blind spot? And editors would ask me in the early days of game journalism, if I had gone native by being too friendly to the companies that I was covering. Gamers also now, after Gamergate, started asking the same question about whether game journalists are, again, too friendly to game companies. The dot-com bubble, tech journalists maybe didn't scrutinize the crazy companies that were coming out. And maybe that bubble would have happened anyway. But it was funny, I worked at the Red Herring at the time, and the owners of the Red Herring wrote a book called The Internet Bubble. And it was a pretty good book warning about what was coming. But their own company wasn't positioned for the eventual collapse. And so the Red Herring basically went out of business, even though the owners foresaw what was happening there. You could think of this difference of inside and outside of being the trade press versus the mainstream press. At the trade press, you may pick up a lot better rumors, but do you just go ahead and print them? The mainstream press has a lot of standards for figuring out what the truth is. That last point, about the Vietnam War, it really does show you how the change you have in perspective and the diversity of your sources, and whether you're getting all points of view or not, or if you're sort of selectively choosing the information and facts you want to present, and deciding the truth is a very simple thing, right? In the Vietnam War, like places like Time Magazine, they had their reporters who were witnessing the war in the field in Vietnam, writing very skeptical, stories about who was winning. And in Washington, D.C., they had the bosses of these people overruling them and writing more optimistic stories based on sourcing they had, with the Pentagon or with other folks. So you can just sort of see like why it's important to have this ability to go back and forth between outside and inside. Journalistic ethics do matter. If we get free stuff and free trips, we should disclose it. We take long-term loans for consoles, some machines, that are maybe too expensive for us to buy. We borrow them. We disclose that. If we take trips from groups like associations, we disclose that when we're writing about something that happens at those events, but we don't take free trips from companies. And that's VentureBeat's policy. The game press will not have the same policies, I think. The trade press will not. Now, a lot of people get their information from people like this, right? and you remember my followers. Oops, I'm going to go back. You remember my followers was in the thousands, right? So PewDiePie is doing a little better than me. He's not a quiet person. He's a Nazi sympathizer, but hey, can't be perfect, right? I think this sort of just draws the distinction between the influential people in the industry. On the one side, you do have journalists. On the other side, it's a new age. There's, game journalism is changing. You guys asked about how game journalism is changing. Well, these people are in the picture now, and they're more like personalities and entertainers than they are journalists. And they, they can command the attention of companies more so than the game journalists can now. And so I think that is an issue. It leads, to this idea, though, of, why aren't more people getting paid to play games, right? I call this the leisure economy. If you think of what's going to happen in the future, if we have self-driving cars, then, we're going to have a couple hours free during the commute, when we're driving. Half the time we spend on mobile phones now is spent playing games, right? So logically, the amount of time we're going to spend playing games in the future is going to go up. If AI comes along and wipes out half the jobs that exist right now, including journalism, right? Then what are we going to do? Do we have to work? Do we want to work? Why should we work if somebody else is going to do what we used to do, right? Well, maybe you can play instead, right? And Bing Gordon, one of the early employees of Electronic Arts, he raised this point years ago. Like, why don't companies actually pay gamers to play their games, and what models can exist to make that happen? I think we're pretty far along this road already of all these kinds of people who make money playing games. And everybody sort of used to envy being a game journalist because you got free games, right? But there's a lot more people who can actually make a living in this kind of leisure economy in the future, I think. Super haters. Well, I talked about having super fans, but yeah, I also have super haters. I'm that Cuphead guy, right? So I posted a 26-minute video back in August from a demo I had at Gamescom in Germany. And it was the first time I played Cuphead, and the first time a lot of people were able to see what the actual gameplay was like. So it was a very sort of noticed video. But I did a terrible job playing it, right? And I spent about 2.5 minutes getting through a 30-second tutorial. And it took me, actually, I didn't get through the entire first level when I played for the rest of those 24 minutes or so. So this went viral on the internet. And it got 1.2 million video views on YouTube. Like, that's like astounding for VentureBeat video, right? I mean, we don't even make videos. The best we do is we post our captured video. But there was a, I'm okay with sort of people attacking me for this and saying, you're unqualified to play games or to be a game journalist or to review games. And I was perfectly fine with people seeing this video and concluding that. But there was a post to go with this that kind of said, this is kind of a joke, right? This is me making fun of myself. I'm sort of self-deprecating here. And I do that a lot. But people didn't see that post, and they sort of went straight into the video. And they went into the video thanks to a guy that I would call a shitlord, right? And on the internet, in this age of internet haters, we have shitlords who can direct our hate into proper direction, right? And so he got hold of my video. It had 10,000 views at the time or so. And it had, by the time he had shared it and said, this is why game journalists are unqualified to review games, or they can't even play. Ooh, I don't know how that happened. So, one sec, lost my place. So he kind of helped me get so many more views for my video because, he sort of cast it in a fake news kind of way, right? And it's very interesting to me how, Gamergate and fake news, share all this common heritage, right? And when you think about Zoe Quinn and what they went after her for, these major transgressions of supposedly sleeping with journalists in order to get positive reviews. And they said, well, okay, that didn't really happen, but maybe it's more like, using your friends to get positive coverage. And well, maybe that's not true. So maybe it's more like, well, they should have disclosed that they were friends or something whenever she got some kind of coverage. And it turns out that, say, the biggest crime there would have been more on the game journalist and not on Zoe Quinn herself, right? So disclosing things, yeah, it's a good idea, but I don't know, and I'm not sure. I get back to my right slide. Let's see. Here. So yeah, I wasn't very good at this game. The nice thing was the game journalist came to my defense. Influencers like PewDiePie created videos making fun of me, so they really magnified that million views into many more millions of views. And yeah, it was funny. It was sort of taking an easy shot at somebody, but being on the receiving end of this, it sort of made me understand what it's like to walk in the shoes of a person who's getting totally roasted on the internet, right? And we all make sort of cruel and snide comments, and we look at other people that we don't like and we throw hate their way on the internet. It's really easy to do that. It's really easy to do that anonymously. But you just walk in the shoes of these people who are getting so many negative comments, and things like, you should just go kill yourself, right? You get 100 of those a day. It kind of brings you down, right? And so you have to sort of figure out, okay, who am I going to listen to here, right? And when everybody in the world, it seems like, is telling you that what you're doing is shit, are you going to still keep doing what you do? It sort of made me think about, like, okay, well, we need to be kinder to people. We need to go back to those ideas that I always liked about journalism, which is walk in the shoes of somebody else, get a different point of view, understand what it's like to be someone, and have some kind of empathy. And I think that's what some of the best journalists really do, is that they're not personalities who are sort of entertaining you. They're good listeners and people who have empathy. I got through this little difficult time for me. It lasted really only 10 days at the most before the internet's attention went on to somebody else or something else. And having a sense of humor and some humility about it, telling people they should be kinder. Sometimes they would respond and actually, sort of reciprocate. So, but I do think gamers, sometimes they have legitimate gripes, right? And when they have a good gripe, they make themselves heard these days, through the internet. And it turns out to be a good thing. But quite often, though, you can also see from the game developer's point of view, like, why would I want to make games for these people, right? I think they should ask these questions about outside in and inside out the same way that journalists do. Do you want to make fun of people who aren't skillful? Is it okay to drive noobs and the unskilled away from gaming? For me as a business writer, this one about do you welcome a broader industry which will get you more and better games? That's the best argument in the world for welcoming people into gaming, right? And for welcoming diversity in games as well, and diversity among game developers. Like, why would you react in a negative way to things that are going to get you what you want? And so I don't understand, the resistance that we've seen, and I really sort of hope that it is temporary. I mean, the latest rendition of this is really the loot boxes argument that people are having with Electronic Arts right now over Star Wars Battlefront 2. They kind of do forget, I think, that EA used to charge for downloadable content that came out after the game came out, right? Maybe 3-4 packs that they'd sell for $15 a piece. They decided that fragmented the community too much, and they made those available for free. And they've figured out a way through loot boxes to just figure out how to recover some of that lost money. I think I'm kind of okay with that. But a lot of gamers are not. So you wind up with gamers who feel like they're being attacked in a ghetto, that's looked down upon by outsiders still. It doesn't get the resources it deserves. It doesn't welcome new people. And I think this is, something that's not right about the industry still. These are my goals as a game journalist. Seek out new perspectives, creating successful game events where we can make better games happen. Continue to write about the diversity of the industry, chronicling the journey of people, games, and companies from cradle to grave. A gazillion died last week, and that's a case in point of where I was covering them at the beginning, and I covered them at the end as well. I have those 15,000 stories I've written at VentureBeat. I don't think of them as stories so much as the people I met along the way. I always wrote more stories because I was writing stories about people who wouldn't have stories written about them otherwise. People who are doing Kickstarters or something like that. I think Susan Cain's Quiet Book is one to admire. And she asked this question in there: how did we go from valuing character to valuing personality without realizing that we sacrificed something meaningful along the way? Listening, I think, gets you a long way, and you can find stories that no one else is telling that way. And if I have advice, it is the Kurt Vonnegut quote for people in the industry: we are who we pretend to be, so we must be careful about who we pretend to be. These are some of the conclusions that I've sort of come to in thinking about this talk. I would love to see game journalism thrive as both a business and a profession and an art. I hope everybody gets paid to play games just like I do. Keeping this distinction between journalism and entertainment matters, and realizing the difference between fake news and real news, that matters. Be kind, don't be cruel. I think gamer culture should grow up. It should not stay stuck in time. Gamers are everywhere. Games find a way. That's a quote from Seamus Blackley, who was one of the creators of the original Xbox. And he was inspired by Jurassic Park and that line in there where they say life finds a way. Whatever obstacles are presented in front of it, life finds a way. And games make their way onto new platforms, even if they are not intentionally created for games. The term gamer, of course, has lost its meaning. Diversity matters, so does the diversity of sources and perspectives. This whole sort of diversity cause plays perfectly and goes hand in hand with good journalism. I I love creating a career that really didn't exist before and reinventing myself, especially by moving from newspapers to the web. I think you'll all be called upon to do that during your careers. I enjoy covering game companies from cradle to grave. I wait a lifetime to get to games like The Last of Us, and I do wish that my brother was around to play it with me.